Recording in.
不介意的话，留下来喝杯。
Hello, Vinicius.
Hello, Jane. Good to see you.
Yeah, we never see each other here.
Okay, so we'll start now. I want to start by welcoming you all to Behind the Screens, Conversations Unpacking Cinema. I'm Dr. Rachel Schaff, postdoctoral teaching fellow in screen studies and one of the co-programmers of this series. Behind the Screens features interactive conversations with industry professionals, practitioners, and cutting-edge scholars to probe the behind the scenes of screen cultures across myriad forms, practices, topics, and debates. Behind the Screens is co-sponsored by the BA in Screen Cultures and the World Languages, Literatures, and Culture programs in the School of Humanities and Sciences in collaboration with the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival. It's co-programmed by me and Dr. Patricia Zimmerman, Charles A. Professor of Screen Studies at the Roy H. Park School of Communications. Ari Kiseloff, Assistant Professor of Strategic Communications, is our producer. We're very honored and really excited that our final event of this inaugural semester of Behind the Screens is a special roundtable on streaming with 3 of the top scholars researching and writing about streaming as a shift in film culture. So to start, Netta Alexander is an assistant professor of film and media at Colgate University and the assistant editor of Journal of Cinema and Media Studies. Her work focuses on digital culture, film and media, and science and technology studies. Her award-winning analysis of buffering revealed in the understudied ways in which latency and delay are inherent to digital systems and infrastructures. Her recent book, Failure, co-authored with Arjun Appadurai from 2020, studies how Silicon Valley and Wall Street monetize failure and forgetfulness. Her articles have appeared in Journal of Visual Culture, Cinema Journal, Synergy, Film Quarterly, which she edited this really fabulous Film Quarterly dossier on binge watching that I'm sure will come up today, Media Fields Journal, Flow Journal, and many other publications. She's also contributed chapters to anthologies like The Netflix Effect, Compact Cinematics, and Pandemic Media. Her public scholarship encompassing topics such as the Internet of Medical Things, predictive personalization, and the limits of technology has been published in The Atlantic, Public Books, Real Life Magazine, The Brooklyn Rail, and Haaretz. Girish Shambhu, who our second person on the round table, is professor of management at Canisius College in Buffalo, where he teaches sustainability and supply chain management. In a dual career as film blogger, critic, and scholar, Girish is also the author of The New Cinephilia, an editor of Film Quarterly's online column Quorum. His writings have appeared at the Criterion Collection, Framework Journal of Film and Media, and Film Quarterly. So last but not least, rounding out this roundtable is Jane Shattuck, who's the professor of visual and media studies at Emerson College. She's the author of Television, Tabloids, Tears, Fassbinder, and Popular Culture, and Taking Care in the Talking Cure, Television Talk Shows and Women, and the editor of Hop on Pop, the politics and pleasures of popular culture. Her most recent book is The American TV Industry, co-authored with Michael Curtin. She is currently working on a new book analyzing international streaming. She has taught at the University of Vermont and the University of Wisconsin-Madison and was a fellow at Bonn University in Bonn, Germany. Dr. Patricia Zimmerman, Charles A. Dana Professor of Screen Studies, will conduct this roundtable. At the end of the roundtable, we'll invite the participants here to engage in a Q&A. We ask that you raise your digital hand so that we can get you all into the conversation. Following this 1 hour session, we'll invite you to a 15-minute after party for a more informal conversation with the roundtable participants and each other. So without further ado, I'll hand this over to Dr. Patricia Zimmerman.
Thank you, Rachel, for that wonderful opening. And I do want to extend a very big welcome to our participants in the audience tonight. We have people joining us from Scotland, England, France, Germany, Spain, Mexico, Argentina, Hong Kong, Singapore, Canada, and across the United States. And it's so wonderful to see so many people from our film and media culture community here tonight. And I want to particularly welcome all of you. And finally, I really would like to welcome students who are here from many different institutions. And it's just wonderful to have students here with scholars of cinema and also with people in the industry who are festival programmers and who work for distribution companies. So welcome, everyone. So we're going to start off with some quick position statements from our speakers. And I'm going to ask Jane Sheddick from Emerson College to kick it off for us.
Thanks, Patty. So I think tonight I'm going to just talk to kind of the economics, and I'm going to actually sort of stick to Netflix as the boogie monster of streaming. And I just want to say this is a period of profound change for film scholars and for just film and media in general in the United States. It is now going to shift from Los Angeles to the Silicon Valley. It is being run by technological thinking, algorithms, and this is a shift that we have to rethink. And the whole notion of the collective experience that we associate with film, or even the collective experience that we associate with the heyday of television, where we all experience similar, we're going to be in a more atomized, more calculated culture. And so I just want to talk to the kind of neoliberalism that is behind all this. American economics have changed. And that since the 1990s, when you see deregulation come along, this is brought to you by Ronald Reagan and also by Thatcher and the ideas of the University of Chicago Economics Department. So right now, what is guiding the major technology companies, and they're known as FANG on the stock market. FANG stands for Facebook, although now it's become Meta, Amazon, let's see, who else do I want? Alphabet, which is formerly Google, and Netflix, and what else do I want? I guess the G is Alphabet, formerly Google. Do you realize as of this last August, these companies, which are central to streaming, were worth over $7 trillion. This is not a small audience. In fact, if we want to just think about Netflix audience right now, it has over, let's see, 203 million subscribers at this point. So here you have this kind of massiveness on both the scale of economics and in the scale of reception. And it's really hard to calculate, with Amazon, who's a subscriber to, Amazon Video. But why I want to stay with Netflix is that it's the largest entertainment media company by market capitalization. And also it's the one devoted totally to streaming. That's my 3 minutes.
Thanks, Jane. Very provocative and right on time. We're going to go to Netta next.
Thank you. And thank you, Patty and Rachel, for organizing this and for everyone joining us tonight. So I have 3 quick questions, and hopefully we will be able to answer at least one of them, if not all of them, tonight. So the first one, building on Elena Philippe's 3 Ps in relationship to streaming, which are personalization, participation, and plentitude. I want to add 2 new Ps to help us rethink of how we should be theorizing streaming these days. So the first is the pandemic, and how does the pandemic and our growing dependencies on streaming and online communication and video conferencing change our relationship with screens more generally. And then the other one is play something, which is a feature that Netflix recently added to its interface. So play something, which works much like the shuffle feature on Spotify. It's just introducing this idea of randomness. So how can we negotiate the idea of randomness with the idea, of course, of users, agency, choice, and personalization? And then the second question is, how can we understand and theorize streaming as a form of unpaid labor? So to build on what Jane just presented, it's the idea that we as users produce value for these companies by using those services. We in fact train their algorithms by making different choices. Also, if we're not making a choice, that in itself provides important data for the company. And then the third and last question has to do with the short and long-term effects of the dubbing and translation global economy, which is being in some ways produced and sustained by Netflix and the demand, not just Netflix, but the demand of streaming services at large. And the idea that is called English templating, which means that translators all over the world were trying to make a deadline and translate Squid Games most recently, but they had to do that by translating an English translation of the original Korean screenplay. So what we get is either dubbing or subtitles, which are two-way removed from the original culture as well as the original language. And how does that form of global television look like? So these are my questions for tonight.
Thank you, Netta, and thank you for staying on time with your 3 provocations. Girish.
Thank you, Patty, and thank you, Rachel, for organizing this event. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation, for learning from all of you. So streaming is not really the focus of my research. I come at it from the point of view of a cinephile, and because my research has to do with cinephilia and film culture. I'm especially interested in alternative streaming, what we might call alternative streaming, to distinguish it from what could be called big streaming. So Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, HBO, Disney. And these alternative streaming services, they could be for-profit services like Criterion Channel, Mubi, Ovid, or they could be not-for-profit services like Another Screen, which is the streaming arm of the feminist film journal Another Gaze, run by Daniela Schreier. And so there's 3 things that I'm interested in the context, especially of alternative streaming. The first would be the diversity of film and media that's available. Big streaming doesn't really dig that deep into the history of cinema. It kind of privileges the new, the contemporary, and these other streaming services do a much better job of featuring older films. In addition, there's a diversity of film and media forms on these sites, like features and shorts, fiction films, documentaries, experimental films, etc. And finally, a diversity of makers. So especially, it's often emphasized on these sites. So films by women, by Black, Indigenous, POC creators, by queer filmmakers, disabled filmmakers, and so on. After diversity, number 2 would be access. The history of cinephilia has been written mostly by people who lived and went to the movies in big cities like New York, London, Paris, who had a kind of metropolitan privilege. But as someone who lives in a smaller city, Buffalo, New York, these streaming services allow me to see a wide range of offerings that weren't available to me even just a few years ago. In addition, there's also lower barriers of access now for economically disadvantaged viewers and also for disabled viewers. So those are very important kind of developments too. Finally, number 3 is something I'm going to call contextualist presentation. And what I mean by this is streaming services that surround movies with materials, old and new, like essays or interviews or supplementary videos. An example of this would be Another Screen's program on Palestinian women's cinema, for which new essays were commissioned, old essays and interviews were translated, etc. And this makes for a much richer experience for the viewer, and it's also involved in a process of writing new histories. So these would be my 3 points: diversity, access, and contextualist presentation. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Girish. And again, right on time. You are all so fabulous about this. So we've covered so much ground. We've looked at the bogeyman of course, of Netflix and the trillions of dollars generated by these behemoths and the massiveness. We've looked at unpaid labor issues and, of course, issues of the labor of translators. And we've looked at little streaming as opposed to big streaming, right? These kind of micro sites, which are situated all over the world. So this is a very big terrain and a very big unknown terrain for scholars. So I want to start out with a question. And my question is going to focus on, first of all, something people don't think about that much, but I think comes up in all 3 of yours, is the question of labor. How do we think about labor? Because when we think about these streamers, we often think about the content. And it's, Jane has some interesting things about how auteurism has been concocted on streamers. And then we'll get Netta and Girish in as well, because I think all of your presentations raise the issue of labor, who's making the works that we're seeing. So Jane.
Well, I think people know this already, that it's a devil's bargain to work with these large streamers. They will give you more money up front, but you don't own the work. And that, whatever profit is entailed in the number of subscribers that Netflix gets as a result of your work. Another thing that's going on with that is that they're bearing the name of the filmmaker at Netflix in this kind of, vast array. They don't advertise. And so it's a very different way of understanding film and even television now. I guess in some ways film has become a kind of televisional medium, and therefore the director is not important. And so they bury the name, and we got to rethink how are these directors and what kind of labor is going on with these particular works that we haven't seen in the past, the structure of labor. So, above the line, below the line are very different right now.
Oh, fascinating. And, Netta, you raised the issue, so many issues of labor, from the unpaid labor of the so-called spectator who's so-called having choice, to the incredible complexity of translator labor. Share some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm actually going to add yet another perspective or yet another angle to that. I was recently teaching a chapter from Ed Finn, What Algorithm Want, in which he tells us that originally when Netflix started using human taggers to watch all of the content library and to assign micro tags, like this is a happy ending, this is emotionally ambivalent, and so on. So they started paying human beings to do that, calling them taggers, but they were trying to hide the fact that they do that, and they were trying to hide the existence of these workers because they want to maintain the illusion that this is in fact the algorithm that does the personalization, and so the magic is in the machine. However, only around 2015 or 2016, not only that they decided to stop denying that fact, but also we started seeing human taggers interviewing in different interviewing in the press. So I think that process from saying this is strictly AI, this is strictly numbers and algorithm, to actually this is human and machine coming together to provide the best recommendation is a really fascinating shift.
Yeah, the question of human and machines. When we were thinking of old school cinema, we're thinking of humans being somewhere with others. Girish, I think what you said raises issues of labor as well, because you make a very strong point about two things. One is the diversity of makers on these little streamers around the world. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little more, because it's so critical to think about what are these other places, and how are we getting access to other kinds of film workers?
Yeah, and that's a great question, Patty. I find that a lot of these smaller sites, one of the issues, of course, is that they're very underfunded because, as Jane pointed out, living in the regime of neoliberalism, the arts and culture sector has been systematically defunded over the last few decades. And so especially these smaller outfits have very little funding. So they have to do GoFundMes or Patreons in order to even put up a film series. That's what Another Screen did. They ran a Patreon. And Daniela, who ran Another Screen and who runs Another Gaze, personally had to go and reach out to these filmmakers from around the world. And when she had to do that, that was labor that she and her team had to undertake without proper remuneration.
Another one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good thing it's a good thing I
Can I ask people who are our participants to please mute? Thank you. Go ahead, Girish.
And I also wanted to say that it's actually wonderful work, this kind of alternative streaming work. But at the same time, a lot of it is done as a labor of love because there's no funding there. And so there's a pressure on programmers and people who run these sites to actually do this as a passion, which is kind of an insidious, structurally insidious thing.
I agree.
To find solutions for somehow, yeah.
Jane, you were saying you agree?
Oh, I agree that it's insidious that people are to do this for love. And yet this industry is so moneyed. And here you have these people that have been marginalized, as you so well said, by neoliberalism that we don't fund. There isn't the government funding like there used to be. We don't think of the state as having a role in controlling the large or helping the small. And so granting has gone down. And so, yeah, this whole notion of labor of love, it's upsetting, to think about.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, Girish, about your point about, I love this point about contextualist presentation of all the rich value-added content. And of course, I'm listening to it thinking, who's writing it, who's translating it, who's uploading, who's downloading, who's building that interface, right? And again, this kind of quote unquote labor of love. Can I bring us to a hardcore labor issue, which is IATSE, right? IATSE has been in the news. October was called Striketober, right? And so we've got people at John Deere and cereal companies on strike. And we had the threat of the strike. And of course, IATSE just by a very narrow margin passed the contract. And I was thinking about this panel because as I was reading the trades, there was so much about IATSE and the labor exploitation of the below the line workers on the productions of streamers. So anyone want to take us through IATSE and your thoughts on the unions in relation to streaming?
Well, I'll just say that Netflix is funding a lot of independent work, which is much like this issue of these small, well, it just happened with Russ, but you have a whole new class of ununionized people working on these small productions. And again, it's just the money up front allows these productions to be made, but they are made on a shoestring and then absorbed into the larger streamers. So yeah. And I think the example of Russ is having amateurs working and, and people who are not unionized and new labor, so.
And Jane, I'm just gonna ask an obvious question, but for some of our participants on this Zoom who maybe aren't familiar with the Rust controversy, could you give us a little thumbnail sketch of the issues?
Well, I think it's already been in the news quite, because what happened in the process of making a film, and it's an alternative, a small independent film being made off, and it was in New Mexico. And in the process of making it, a gun was used with actual live ammo, and it killed the DP, who is right, where the gun was directed, and there was not supposed to be live ammunition. And it's turned out this is an issue of labor and dealing with, really unseasoned labor in the process of making this film. And so, again, it's not only an issue of these people being paid so little, it's also an issue of professionalism that, to what degree, can we exploit untried labor? So, that's my point. Okay, so.
Good point. It really bared all the problems, right, in the industries now between union and non-union labor, union, non-union. I want to extend this issue of labor and pick up on Neta's point about translation. As I listened to all of you, every example you gave was of a global company or global media, right? Global makers. And of course, it sounds very wonderful to go global, but to do that requires translation, right? Not just into English, but also into other languages. So I wonder if, Neta, would you like to take us through some of the issues you see in translation in terms of streaming?
Yeah, I would just say, first of all, there's a lot of downsides to Netflix going global that has to do with the, local industries are just unable to compete with the kind of resources and money that Netflix can bring into a local market. And that is not necessarily a good thing, right? Especially when we're talking about more smaller culture. I mean, I'm coming from Israel, so thinking about the very small industry of Hebrew speaking television show that suddenly has been in some ways co-opted by Netflix, and now that changes the political economy of these micro market, if you want to call them like that. And then the issue that I was alluding to earlier with translation has to do with Netflix needs more and more translating power, and you might ask yourself, why can't they just come up with an algorithm to do that, right? Why can't they just use speech recognition and natural language processing to do that? And the answer is because the results are terrible. And we know that because we do it whenever we watch YouTube or whenever we teach YouTube clips as teachers, and we do the automated captions, or even if you're trying to do the automated subtitles for this Zoom session right now, you will see that it is far from being satisfactory. And so this is not the kind of service that Netflix would like to give. But then we're talking about an ever shrinking market of underpaid translator that now has to work, again, what I call the English templating. So now they have to work from the English screenplay instead of actually from the original language in which the show has been made. So that does open up a lot of new issues.
Jenny, do you want to get in here?
Yeah, Netflix, and a lot of people write about this, that translation is a way of localizing what is a non-local production. So the better the translation, the more it is going to fit into local norms and be liked. And for years, films and television have done a really rotten job. And I'm not saying this is any better, but it's just interesting to hear you speak about this and the labor and the difficulty of this. And so, yeah, I mean, I've interviewed people in Malaysia that are part of the television industry, and they, they want really great translators, but they also say Netflix has become a higher standard of translation just because they pay so well for locals.
Girish, you're really the proponent of the small streamers. And I noticed in all the examples you gave, it was a lot of international work, right? The Palestinian project, and I know you're very interested in that NFB site with the indigenous work. How does issues of globalizing local and translation unravel on some of these small streamers?
It's a very good question, Patty. I think the need to kind of contextualize what's being presented becomes even more in such a case, because there are all kinds of cultural barriers now, linguistic cultural barriers. And with a lot of these films being older, not just new contemporary stuff, there's also historical barriers of historical knowledge. So I think it becomes even more important to like have somebody who truly loves that work, knows that work, and goes out to seek out scholarly work or critical work from the past to kind of surround those films with. I'm also finding that there's a bigger pressure now on scholars to do more public facing work. And that's actually really good, because then they can, from their vast expertise and from the books they've written and all the research they've done over decades, which working critics can't afford to do, their work is now being used in these kind of contextualizing projects. So I think there's a lot of resources available. But again, it comes down to a question of labor. Are people going to be able to are they going to be paid well enough to do this kind of in-depth work? Or are we asking them, are we exploiting them, basically?
Are we exploiting them? And of course, what you said raises a really interesting issue, because your point about contextualist presentation on these smaller streamers, I'm listening to Jane and Netta and thinking, really what scholars and all these interviewers and these rich content are doing is translating, right, that work that may be more obscure for a more general audience. They're functioning as translators in another kind of way. I saw someone who wanted to get in. Was it Jane or Netta? Someone had a hand up. Netta, yeah.
Just want to say to connect it to another layer of flavor, and what Jane was saying in the beginning. I think we should also consider that Netflix famously, notoriously, Reed Hastings, the Netflix CEO, said that their only competitor or their main competitor is not HBO, not Disney Plus, not Hulu, and so on, but the competitor is sleep. And so they see sleep as their main competition, and they say, and we're winning. I think people thought this was a joke. I'm not entirely sure it was a joke. I think the idea of the neoliberal subject as that you can ignore and deny their own biological needs so they can perform on some higher level and become a super user, a super spectator, and so on. So our ability to binge watch, our ability, the drop release model by which they give us the entire season, and I'm supposed to clear my schedule and spend 12 hours in front of a screen, maybe with restroom break if I'm lucky, right? But obviously we know that this is not good for us. And during the pandemic, we learned in the hardest way possible that this screen dependency is not good for our bodies. And yet we are being encouraged to do that kind of labor by binging, by speed watching, by cramming more and more data and more content, which, we used to call it films or stories or whatever. Now we just call it content, but to try and extract the data from those narratives in ways which are very harmful to our own minds and bodies.
And you said something that provokes me to take us to something that you said in your opening remarks about what are basically the 5 Ps. And I want to focus on the big one, the pandemic. I wonder if each of you might be able to take us through what you see as what was the disruption and change in the streaming landscape that we saw in the pandemic. What did the pandemic do to these media landscapes? What did the pandemic do, precipitate in viewers? Netta, you've written so much on binging, right? And I think that the underside of the pandemic has been binging, right, as a way to suppress the traumas out there in the world. So I know it's a big topic, but you're also brilliant. I'm sure you can valiantly dive in. Pandemic and streaming, big or little streaming. How about you, Jane?
Oh, I get to do the big.
You get to do the big.
Okay, and then they are like the angels that come in and talk about independence. Netflix couldn't have been happier for the pandemic. You know, their numbers grew at exponential levels. And so, you know, the success, the only flip side of it was it shut down production. They did escape to, in the beginning, to Iceland and I think to South Korea, where the pandemic wasn't as strong to do the production, but slowly all that got shut down. And so, yeah, you have two sides, and but again, the numbers grew, and you know, we now have even more global Netflix than ever before.
Right. So the pandemic was a fertilizer in some ways.
Fertilizer for membership. Yeah.
Fertilizer for membership. Yeah. Netta, pandemic. Streaming.
Well, I just added to the special section for the recent issue of Film Quarterly. So I'm just going to give a shout out to my incredible contributors to that, which are Kartik Nair, Tina Kendall, and Tanya Orek, who all wrote specifically about binge watching in the age of COVID. So if anyone is interested in reading more about that, I direct you all to Film Quarterly. But to summarize, well, it's going to be impossible, but to try and summarize, what we were trying to do in this special issue was to say, look, theories of binge watching traditionally and historically are looking at that as excessive consumption, addiction, self-harm, and so on. What happened during the pandemic was that suddenly this was reframed as a civic duty. You must stay home, and therefore binging can help you bear the boredom of cabin fever and so on. It was also co-opted as a form of social justice during the Black Lives Matter protest in the summer of 2020. And so suddenly we got all of those listicles of 50 social justice films to stream right now, 75 films by Black filmmakers, and so on. So a very different framing of binging than what we got so far in television studies and binge watching theories. And this phenomenon of Netflix and ill. So instead of Netflix and chill, Netflix and ill, the place in which that can be a therapeutic safe space, which is a safe space because one, we are protected from the virus, which is circulating outdoors, right? And two, because this is a place for us to grieve. This is a place for us to remember how the world used to look like up until January, February, March 2020. So this is a place to binge Friends or Seinfeld or 90s show. So this sense of nostalgia, as well as Tiger King, which gives us a different kind of guilty pleasure. So there was a lot of things that gave this idea of a daily rhythm and synchronization between us and our loved ones that suddenly we couldn't see because of travel bans and because of lockdowns and sheltering in place. And that brought that and the rise and explosion of co-watching apps like Netflix Party and Sling and even Zoom brought families together and brought loved ones together by watching the same show at the same time, right? So instead of commuting, instead of going to the office, we suddenly had that idea of television. So this is really trying to summarize a lot of different ideas in very little time.
Yeah, a lot of ideas where binging becomes a new kind of vaccine in a way. Girish, I'm going to ask you the question about that's related to the pandemic, that is related to your passion for cinephilia, which is film festivals and streaming. Are film festivals part of the streaming landscape? What's happening with film festivals and they're online, and what are you seeing in this domain?
It has had a really disruptive effect on film festivals, as we mentioned earlier, and now the landscape of cinephilia has always been a very unequal, kind of asymmetrical one. You had to be economically able to travel to film festivals. You had to be physically able to travel to film festivals. And suddenly for a while there, as soon as the pandemic hit and many festivals went online, it felt like there was a revolution, you know, and there was this opening for things to change completely. But, and this is not exactly related to festivals, but I recently read an article by a disabled critic who said that she had to travel to a movie theater to see screeners, to see, you know, preview screenings. And then once the pandemic hit, the studio would send her screener links. But now that things are opening back up, the studios they don't want to do that anymore. They want to force the critics to go to the theater. So some of the things that appeared to be getting better to make the playing field a little more level, you know, some of that is being reversed. But to get back to your question about festivals, I think it's the incredible things are happening at film festivals that weren't before. Like, I'll give you a quick example. The Berwick Film Festival, run, you know, with Gemma Desai and Peter Taylor, they had a wonderful session at this festival, which is online, which is virtual, where they talked about what a festival is and what are the processes inside a film festival, that the decision-making processes, and they kind of showed the innards of a film festival and, you know, the exploitation and unfairness and inequities of this incredibly honest conversation about the ethics of film festivals was had virtually for a global audience. And that would never have been possible before the pandemic. So I think we've had a window into some incredible conversations during the pandemic because of, you know, streaming.
Right. So we see the pandemic as a point of disruption, you know, in these industrial and alternative structures that I think what I'm hearing from all of you has not really settled yet. It's still a point of massive change. Netta.
Just something to like to Gersh. I remember being struck by the fact when I was reading Netflix with a D in the end, which is the Gina Keating book about the history of Netflix, that originally one of the original taglines was Netflix, a new home for cinephiles, because their competitor was Blockbuster. So they were trying to tell people, come to us, we're going to email you, we're going to mail the DVD, right? And then you won't have to leave your bedroom and you can watch it and no late fees. But this idea that Netflix was thinking of itself as a company as a home for cinephile, when now we know that Netflix is anything but for cinephile. Netflix is for anyone pretty much who is not a cinephile, right? If you're looking for television and, you know, Gwyneth Paltrow and so on, Netflix is a great place to find those things, but not necessarily if you're looking for the Criterion Collection, if you're looking for older films and so on.
I want to bring Jane in on this because she studied it so deeply. And then I want to mention to our participants, after Jane finishes, we'll be inviting you to raise your digital hand and we'll bring you on screen for you to ask your question or engage in dialogue with our roundtable list. So Jane, back to you.
Streaming and the big companies, it's the realm of middle brow. And that's why these small festivals are so important, because there's not going to be artistry on Netflix. They want a classic narrative, not too much difficulty for people just to relax and to enjoy. So the level of difficulty is very limited. They're off to make a profit. They're, you know, so they need a kind of larger common denominator kind of filmmaking or television making. So, you know, increasingly I worry about where creativity is going to come from. And, you know, listening to Girish, I think, well, the small festival may be where it's at. But again, it's not going to happen. I mean, also another side of this is filmmakers are being bought up so quickly by Netflix that they get into the Netflix form, and Netflix doesn't tell people, but they do. They do tell people that this is too complicated. This is, you know, there's a whole bunch of what they call, you know, sending notes that goes on during a Netflix negotiation around a film or a television program. So thank God for small festivals and small filmmakers. Yeah.
Yeah, great point. I'd like to invite our participants and audience to raise their digital hand and get in here and ask questions to our wonderful panelists who have opened up so much. This is always that moment where you're waiting for that first hand to go up.
I just want to say it's fantastic to see so many friends and familiar faces. You're making me very, very happy after a very long day of teaching. So thank you for coming.
Yes. Anybody like to get in? Well, while we're waiting, I have one last question, but I'm going to preface it with, we'd really like to hear from people who are here. Our speakers ask that you come on screen because they would like to see you and not be lost in the digital fog. So I'm going to ask a question while everyone's thinking of something they might want to ask or contribute. You know, what I think you've all shared with us is a very complex ecology and topography of streaming. You know, Jane, you started out with saying we're seeing a shift from LA to Silicon Valley.
Yes.
You know, Netta, you've talked about in other work you've done about algorithms, right? I mean, film scholars were never trained to think about algorithms, interfaces, or software. Girish, you've talked to us about this vast terrain that I think everyone will be excited to explore of, I would call small streamers, festival streamers that are doing something other than the middle brow, classical arc, relatable characters, causality. This seems so vast to me, from technology to studios without walls. It's instantly global, different kinds of spectatorship. You know, can you help us out by maybe some mapping of this? You know, how can we get our heads around this? To me, it seems it goes back to that P that Netta shared, the plenitude P, right? It's just so massive. And, you know, Jane, $7 trillion, 200 million subscribers for Netflix. No, there's this massiveness. You know, how do we start mapping it? You know, where do we know where we are in this? How is it related? Jane, you almost presented Netflix as the great colonizer of the independent film voices.
No, I think
right?
it
An
is.
imperial power, if you will.
And I also was taken up by what Netta said. I think it's fascinating, this kind of way that the big streamers see us as passive and relaxing, and how that influences how, you know, it's a very different than going to a theater. I mean, you want to relax in a theater, but you are, you know, forced into this four-wall attention. And so this kind of passivity and, you know, people on the couch, you know, it's just fascinating that it really affects how television and film are being made.
Oh, Patty.
Yeah, I think I'll let you in, Girish, and then we have a question here. Yeah.
I was just going to ask a simple question, for Netflix related. Why is Netflix's search function so terrible?
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
You would think that's a very simple thing.
You know,
to
you have a
to do
response,
well?
Netta?
Yeah, but Jane, please go ahead.
No, Netta, go ahead.
I mean, the answer is because the Netflix business model is everything is a recommendation, and it's a recommendation service, basically, and they do not want you to actively use the search. And I think if they could, they would just take the search out. They would disable the search function. But there's an early interview with Todd Yellin, who developed Cinematch, the first algorithm of Netflix, when he basically said, look, we know that our content library is very limited and also ever changing because of expiring copyright agreements. And so what we do is we're using microtag as a form of compensation. So when you're going to search for something that obviously we don't have, right? We don't have Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, but maybe we can show something else which is dark, you know, weird, idiosyncratic, or any other David Lynch film instead. So by using microtags, the idea is Netflix will never tell you we don't have it. Or if you think from the perspective of the subscriber, the best service they can offer to you is you search something and they tell you this is available on Hulu, Disney Plus, Criterion Collection, and so on, Canopy, but they will never ever do that. Instead, they will say, oh, you wanted Fight Club? Maybe you actually were looking for, this other David Fincher film that no one cares about, because this is what we have due to our copyright agreement. So I think this is the short answer to your question.
Couldn't have been said better.
Great answer. I'm going to interrupt because we have a question. We actually have another question after this. I'd like to welcome Chris Horak to the screen. Hi, Chris. Good to see you.
Hi, Jane.
Yeah,
Haven't
hey,
seen
Chris.
you in years. Listen,
Yes.
first of all, I've been a Netflix user for maybe more than 10 years, and I still get DVDs from them. And of
Oh.
course, what they have on DVD is infinitely a wider selection than you get on the streaming service. But
Particularly film.
particularly film. And
Yeah.
as far as the search engines are concerned, there is no good search engine in any of these streaming services. They're all lousy, regardless. Even, HBO and all of the, Max, all of them are really lousy. If you're looking for specifics, you're not going to find it. But I wanted to actually say something else, and that is that this moment reminds me a bit of the early 70s when cable first came in. And there was this huge promise that cable was going to democratize media. It would make everything available, etc. And that is the promise of these streaming services too, because in point of fact, technologically, it is possible that we could have everything online and available at our fingertips. But in fact, none of that happens. And the reason it doesn't happen is because it is ultimately just too expensive to maintain all of those servers with all of that content online. So even Netflix, they limit, they pretend bountifulness when in fact they have a very limited offering, and they hook you into it that way. But it's
The cornucopia.
the cornucopia is never going to be there. And unfortunately, and I agree with Grish that the smaller services are just are like, they're not going to last. I mean, they just don't have the capital that is necessary. And even, I mean, look at what happened to Criterion. Criterion is now kind of part of some other service. I don't know. Aren't they, or do they have their own channel? I don't know.
They do have their own.
But there was that. What was that art film service before that went under about a year ago?
Filmstock.
Yeah, Filmstock.
Yeah, that's right.
And so this is going to continue to happen. Even at TCM, well, they're now part of HBO Max, right? So, but it's the economics, because it's all too expensive. And the other thing we have to consider is the amount of energy and that all of these streaming services use. I mean, it is massive, massive, massive. And
Right.
the question is, can we afford it? Can we really afford it if we want to think ecologically? Thank
Right.
you.
Good to see you.
Yeah, Netta, you want to engage Chris's point?
Yeah, just quickly, when Reed Hastings launched the global television, which is Netflix, he used this phrase, watch whatever, whenever. And watch whatever, whenever. If you're a television historian, you should know that it's from Betamax commercial. So it was a Betamax commercial from 1976. So this promise of on-demand is not a new promise at all. In fact, it existed since the invention of remote control, and then VCR, DVR, and TiVo, and so on. So Netflix did not come up with it. And then the other thing I wanted to say is just to point to the really amazing, brilliant work being done by Laura Marks on the environmental cost of streaming services, and the fact that the carbon footprint of even what we're doing right now, which is Zooming, video conferencing with the video on, is actually has a very large carbon footprint or larger than we would like to imagine. So thank you for bringing that up, because I think it's something that we need to be more aware of.
Thanks so much, Chris. Always, you're so provocative. Good to see you. And I think this is actually Sean Zimmerman, Ash.
Oh, my God. Oh, I'm
Did you have a question?
I did have a question, but before I get to my question, I'd just like to thank Netta, Girish, Jane, and you, Mother, for a lovely conversation. My question is quite simple. I just love to know if the release of Roma on Netflix presents a counterpoint to the narrative that large streaming companies are valuing profit over art. And then follow up to that would be, is it possible for profit and art to coexist in the digital ecosystem, which you've outlined here today? And thank you for the opportunity to ask this question.
I would just say that something like Criterion is, were you referring to the Criterion restoration of Roma? The Criterion channel is like I would say one of the small streamers, not one of the, the behemoths.
I think he was referring to Alfonso Cuarón film.
Oh,
yeah, that's correct.
That one that went on to win many awards.
Right. Yeah. So Criterion it does make a profit, and it's a small company. But I see it in a different league from these huge behemoths, Netflix, Hulu, Amazon. They're just not even in the same league.
Right.
So I think it's possible to do that. And I think over the last year or two, faced with criticism about lack of diversity, now the diversity on something like the Criterion channel, I think is quite remarkable, and gives me all kinds of FOMO. There's so much interesting stuff there that as a cinephile, I don't get to watch. But
anyone on Roma and Netflix?
Yeah, I
Jane?
want to talk about it. I know a lot about Roma and Netflix. Sean, nice to see you. I think Netflix is going to always produce 2 or 3 prestigious works known by known auteurs every few years, because it's not about the profit, because those are the smaller audiences that aren't really watching Roma, but rather word of mouth and this kind of, to give it prestige, make it part of the cultural conversation through these more prestigious works. And, as much as I love Roma, it is a pretty straightforward narrative. I mean, you follow this arc of this family. And so, it isn't, nor is, what's the Scorsese one that they did, The Irishman? Again, a prestige work, but again, following a lot of Hollywood structure in its construction. So, it's arty, but still highly narratively driven. Okay, so that's, they need that just for publicity's sake.
Great, the lost leader. We have 3 minutes left. And what I'd like to do now is, we have 3 minutes left. I'd like to invite our participants and audience to stay. We'll have another 15 minutes for more dialogue. It'll be a little less formal, but I do want to give each of our panelists each 45 seconds each to share a takeaway from tonight or questions that you're now thinking of. And our topic is streaming. So I'm going to ask Girish, I'm going to go in reverse order. Girish, could you go first?
I'd like to say that what Netta was talking about in terms of, for me, the hidden labor behind technology, I'd like to learn more about. And Jane focusing on Netflix and labor practices, unfair labor practices. I think this is something that needs to become common knowledge. At least I'm not aware of details in these areas. And I think I want to go out and learn more about these. So these were my big kind of takeaways.
Netta, takeaways.
Well, I feel we covered so many different things. So I want to second Girish with the idea of thinking more about labor, thinking more about access. The question of access is a quite complicated one for disabled users. And to connect that to the question we just said about trauma, Netflix has a tendency to market itself as a wokeness. There's a Netflix woke and wokeness trend. And I think part of it is when they introduced the playback speed watching feature, they said we do that for blind and deaf users, which I'm very cynical about, because originally when they introduced the feature in 2018, they just introduced it because they knew every other platform, media player, enable playback speed and changing the settings. So this is about profit. It's about maximizing time on site. This is not about taking care of your blind subscriber who are used to listen to audiobooks twice as fast. So the way in which they co-opt and commodify this idea of accessibility is something I've been thinking about these days. And then the last thing to connect to the pandemic, do we have streaming fatigue? And if we do, why? And if we don't, when will we hit that mark in which the Netflix graph will stop just going up and up and up and up and exploding, but will reach a point in which people are saying, you know what, I do not want to consume that much content and do not want to consume that content. And then what will happen? So what will be this saturation point? And are we there yet?
Excellent. And Jane, take it out. We have 40 seconds.
Okay, first of all, I just want to keep on talking to Netta about what you just said, but because I'm interested, that saturation point that you just talked about, is there a saturation with this middle brow quality? Are we going to start at some point wanting alternative channels that actually break the mold of Netflix? And I think that's a really important question. And God help you, do not work for Netflix. It's a devil's bargain. They pay you a lot, they give you lots of vacation, but they watch you. It's like Big Brother at Netflix. They're always over your shoulder questioning. It's a hothouse there. And it's the same thing you've heard of Amazon up in Seattle. The treatment of employees is really amazingly bad, but it's a devil's bargain. You get paid really well.
And we're 1 minute over. I want to close it out. And I'd like everybody to please unmute and give a round of applause to our fabulous roundtablists, Netta Alexander, Girish Shambhu, Jane Shattuck, for a fabulously, I felt like we were tilling the soil of an unknown country called streaming. So I want to thank you. I want to thank all our participants from all over the world. And I see hands up. If your hands up, stay on. We'll have 15 minutes of lively exchange, and it will be a little more informal and a lot more ideas. So thank you everybody for a wonderful event. And thank you again to our incredible speakers. And let's get the slide off. Please stay for our after party and more conversation. And we ask people who are joining us, the speakers, really find it helpful if your camera's on, especially because professors are a little tired of speaking to the black box. So I know there were people with their hands up. If you're still here, I think Katie Gray and Nina